The auctioneer's gavel came down with a small, dry sound, and for a long moment nobody in the back of that drafty county hall said anything at all. They just turned their heads, slow and curious, like cattle in a field, to look at the woman who had raised her hand. Margaret Ellsworth was 73 years old. She wore a wool coat the color of old slate, a coat she had owned since 1994, and beneath it a simple navy dress she had pressed that morning on a borrowed iron at the boarding house on Route 9. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. Her gloved hands were folded in her lap now, very still, the way her mother had taught her to fold them in church when she was a child of 6. $8. That was the bid she had made. $8 for the abandoned Bethel United Methodist Church on the corner of Sycamore and Old Mill Road, in the village of Hadley's Crossing, North Carolina, population 411. The building had stood empty for 31 years. The roof leaked. The windows were boarded. A red oak had grown up so close to the east wall that its branches had pushed through the stained glass of the apse like fingers reaching for something. The county had been trying to sell it, or give it away, or condemn it, for almost a decade. Nobody had wanted it, until Margaret raised her hand. The auctioneer cleared his throat. "Sold," he said, to the lady in the gray coat, for $8. Somebody laughed. It was not a kind laugh. It was the kind of laugh men make when they think a woman has done something foolish, and they are glad to be there to witness it. Margaret did not turn around. She stood up, smoothed the front of her coat, and walked to the small folding table at the front of the room where a tired clerk in a brown sweater was writing out the deed. She paid her $8 in singles, for ones from one pocket and 4 from the other, because that was how she had counted them out at the boarding house that morning, knowing exactly what she had and exactly what she could spend. The clerk slid the deed across the table. Margaret took it. She folded it once, very carefully, along the crease the clerk had already made, and tucked it inside the inner pocket of her coat where it sat against her ribs, just above where her heart was beating. Then she walked out of the county hall, into the thin February sunlight, and stood on the concrete steps for a moment, breathing. Her breath came out as a small white cloud. The cold went straight through the wool of her coat, but she did not mind it. She had been cold for a long time now. The cold inside the courthouse had been worse, in its own way, than the cold out here. She had imagined this moment many times in the 3 weeks since she had seen the listing in the back of the Hadley County Gazette, and in none of those imaginings had she been alone. She had imagined her son David standing beside her, perhaps with one hand on her shoulder. She had imagined her daughter-in-law Patricia making a small, impressed sound. She had imagined her grandchildren, Cole and Annabelle, asking questions in their quick, bright voices about why the church had been built and who had built it. Instead, she stood by herself on those steps, and the only person who looked at her was a man in a green pickup truck across the lot, who shook his head once and then drove away. Margaret walked the half-mile back to the boarding house with her hands deep in her coat pockets, and the deed inside the lining made a small dry sound against her ribs every time she took a step. It was a sound she would remember later, when so much else had been lost or found, as the first true sound of the rest of her life. She had not always been a woman who arrived at boarding houses with 2 suitcases and a leather handbag. For 46 years, she had been the wife of Dr. Henry Ellsworth, a small-town family physician who had practiced medicine out of a converted carriage house on Linden Street in Asheville, North Carolina. They had met in 1972 at a church social, when Henry was finishing his residency and Margaret was teaching the 3rd grade at Asheville Elementary. He had asked her to dance to a song that neither of them remembered later, and at the end of the song he had said, very seriously, "I think I would like to know you for a long time." And Margaret, who was 20 years old that spring, had said, "All right," because it had felt like the most natural thing in the world. They had married 11 months later in the very Methodist church where they had met, a small white-clapboard building on a hill that looked, in retrospect, very much like the building Margaret had just bought for $8. Henry had been a good man. Margaret had no interest in pretending otherwise. He had been a good man for 46 years, even at the very end when the cancer had moved into his bones, and he had lain in the hospital bed they had set up in the front parlor and apologized to her, twice a day, for becoming such a burden. He had not been a burden. He had been her husband. They had raised one son, David, born in 1976, a bright and serious boy who became a bright and serious lawyer, and they had built a life that was modest by some measures and abundant by others. They did not have a great deal of money. Henry had charged what people could pay, and people in the hollows around Asheville often could not pay much, and so the practice had supported them but not enriched them. Margaret had been content with that. She had taught school until David started kindergarten, and then she had stayed home, and she had volunteered at the church and at the library and at the food pantry, and she had thought, on the whole, that her life was a useful one. Henry had died on a Wednesday in October, 2 years and 4 months before the day Margaret bought the church. The funeral had been well attended. The casseroles had arrived for 3 weeks afterward. And then, slowly, the way these things always happen, the casseroles had stopped, and the phone calls had stopped, and Margaret had been left in the small house on Linden Street with Henry's reading chair and Henry's medical books and Henry's pipe still in the rack on the mantelpiece, where she had not been able to bring herself to move it. She had been 69 years old. She had thought that she would simply continue, in the way widows continue, until her own time came. She had not understood then how much of her life had been arranged around the shape of another person, and how much of that shape would have to be filled in again, slowly, by herself. David had begun to visit more often in those months. He drove up from Charlotte with Patricia and the children most weekends, and at first Margaret had been grateful, and then she had begun to notice things. She noticed that David was always looking at the house, at the cabinets, at the deed in the safe deposit box, with a particular kind of expression that she did not at first know how to name. She noticed that Patricia, who had never shown much interest in the contents of Henry's office, had begun to ask careful questions about what the antique medical instruments might be worth. She noticed that the children were no longer brought into her bedroom in the morning to climb up onto the bed and tell her about their dreams, the way they used to, and that instead they were kept in the front parlor with their tablets and their headphones, and that when she went in to greet them, Patricia would say, very gently, "Annabelle, sweetheart, give Grandma some space. You know she needs her rest." Margaret had not needed her rest. Margaret had needed her grandchildren, but she had not known how to say so, and so she had not said it, and the visits had continued, and the careful questions had continued, and the deed had remained in the safe deposit box, and Margaret had begun to understand the expression on her son's face the way one understands a word in a foreign language by hearing it many times in many different contexts. The conversation came in March of last year, 15 months after Henry's death. David and Patricia drove up on a Saturday morning without the children and asked her to make coffee, which they did not drink, and then they sat across from her at the kitchen table where she had eaten breakfast with Henry every morning for 41 years, and David said, "Mom, we've been talking about your situation, and we want to help." Her situation. That was the word he used. Margaret had set down her own coffee cup very carefully, because her hand had begun to shake, and she had said, "What about my situation, dear?" David had a folder. He opened it. Inside were brochures for 3 different assisted living facilities and a printout from a real estate agent named Brenda Whitfield with an estimate of what the house on Linden Street might fetch on the open market, and a single typed page, prepared by David himself, who was after all a lawyer, outlining what he called a transition plan. The plan was that Margaret would sign the deed of the house over to David, who would manage its sale, and that the proceeds, after Patricia's careful calculation of what Margaret could be expected to need for the rest of her life, would be invested in a way that would provide her with a small monthly stipend at one of the 3 facilities. There was, David explained, a particularly nice one in Charlotte that was only 15 minutes from his own house, and Patricia added, smoothly, that the children would be able to visit Grandma all the time, and Margaret would never feel lonely again. Margaret had listened. She had listened all the way through, because that was how her mother had taught her to listen, and because she did not yet trust her voice to come out of her mouth in the right shape. When David finished and slid the typed page across the table toward her, she looked down at it for a long moment, and then she looked up at her son, and she said, "Why?" David had looked confused. "Why, Mom? Why are you doing this? The house is paid for. I have your father's pension. I am not in debt. I am not unwell. I am 69 years old, David, not 95. Why now?" There had been a pause then, and Patricia and David had exchanged a glance that Margaret would think about for many months afterward, and David had said, "Mom, we just want what's best for you." And Patricia had said, "We've been so worried." and Margaret had understood, in that moment, with absolute clarity, what was happening in her kitchen. The firm where David was a junior partner was struggling. He had mentioned it once or twice, in passing, in the months since Henry's funeral. Patricia had recently quit her job to focus on the children. They had bought a larger house the year before, a house Margaret had thought was too large when they bought it, and the mortgage on that house was, she suspected, a great deal of money. The proceeds from the sale of the Linden Street house, in the current Asheville market, would be a great deal of money too. More than enough to ease a struggling firm and a too large mortgage. And the difference between the proceeds and what Margaret would actually need in a small studio apartment at a facility was, of course, also a great deal of money. A great deal of money that would not need to be left in a will, that would not need to be divided, that would not need to be waited for. Margaret had said, very quietly, "I would like to think about it." She had not signed the page that day. She had not signed it the next week or the week after. She had told David she needed time. She had asked Henry's old lawyer, a man named Walter Brennan who had retired but who answered the phone for her anyway, what her rights were and what her options were, and Walter Brennan had told her, gently, that her son had no legal authority over her or her property, and that she could simply say no. She had said no. She had said no in a careful letter that she mailed to David on a Tuesday, and on Friday David had driven up alone, without Patricia, and they had had the worst conversation of Margaret's life in the front parlor of the house on Linden Street. He had told her, his voice rising in a way that reminded her of a smaller, more frightened version of himself from many years ago, that she was being selfish, that she was being unrealistic, that she did not understand what was at stake for his family, that if she would not see reason, he would have no choice but to consider other options. He had used the word competency. He had used the phrase next steps. He had not, quite, threatened her, but he had also not, quite, not threatened her. After he left, Margaret had sat in Henry's reading chair for a long time. The light had moved across the floor, and then up the wall, and then faded, and she had not turned on a lamp. At some point she had begun to weep, very quietly, the way a woman of her generation wept, without sound, with the tears simply moving down her face and into the collar of her dress. She had thought about Henry. She had thought about how Henry would have known what to do, and how Henry was not here to do it, and how she was going to have to figure it out by herself. She had thought about David at 5 years old, in his red pajamas, asking her to check for monsters under his bed. She had thought about the careful, calculating expression on her son's face that afternoon, and she had understood that the boy in the red pajamas was gone, and that the man who had replaced him was someone she did not entirely recognize, and that this was a grief separate from and almost equal to the grief of losing Henry. She had not signed the page. Instead, she had begun, slowly, to make a different plan. She had started by going through Henry's papers in the small office at the back of the house, the office she had not been able to touch for over a year. She had told herself, that first day, that she was only going to file things, only to organize, only to make order out of the careful, gentle disorder Henry had left behind. But she had found, in the bottom drawer of his oak filing cabinet, a manila folder labeled in his small, precise handwriting, for Margaret, Hadley's Crossing. Inside the folder were 3 things. The first was a black and white photograph, very old, of a small white church on a hill, with a tall, narrow steeple and a row of plain windows along each side. On the back of the photograph, in faded pencil, somebody had written, Bethel United Methodist, 1923. The second was a yellowed letter from Henry's grandmother, Cora Ellsworth, dated 1958, addressed to Henry as a boy of 9, telling him about the church where his great-grandfather had served as the pastor, and where his great-grandmother had played the organ for 37 years, and where, his grandmother wrote, the most important parts of our family began. The third was a single page in Henry's own handwriting, dated only 2 months before his death. It said, simply, Margaret, if you ever need a beginning, this is where ours started. Don't forget. H. Margaret had sat on the floor of Henry's office with the folder open in her lap, and she had read the page in Henry's handwriting 4 times, and she had thought, he knew. He knew what was coming. He knew before I did. And he left this for me to find. She had taken the folder to her bedroom. She had put it on Henry's pillow, where his head had used to be. She had slept with her hand on it that night. And in the morning she had begun to make a list. She had sold the house on Linden Street herself, through Walter Brennan's son, who was also a lawyer now and who handled the sale with the kind of quiet competence Margaret recognized from his father. She had sold it for a fair price, which was less than David and Patricia had expected to get for it, but more than enough for what Margaret intended to do. She had not told David. She had simply done it. She had paid off the small remaining property taxes, settled the last of Henry's medical bills, donated his medical instruments to a free clinic in West Asheville that Henry had volunteered at for many years, and divided what remained into 3 parts. The largest part she put into a small, simple trust, the kind of trust her son the lawyer would not have been able to easily contest, with instructions that it was to be used only for the restoration and maintenance of a property she had not yet purchased but intended to. The second part she set aside for the practical needs of a woman beginning a new life. A reliable used car, a few months of rent, basic supplies, a small reserve. The third part, which was much smaller than the other 2, she put in a savings account for her grandchildren, Cole and Annabelle, with a note in her own hand explaining that Grandma loved them very much, and that one day, when they were older, they might want to come and find her. She had packed 2 suitcases. She had taken Henry's old leather doctor's bag, which she had filled with what she could not bear to leave. Their wedding photograph, the folder marked for Margaret, Hadley's crossing, a small collection of letters Henry had written her during his residency, her mother's Bible, and her wedding ring, which had grown too loose on her finger in the last. I would like to think about it. She had not signed the page that day. She had not signed it the next week or the week after. She had told David she needed time. She had asked Henry's old lawyer, a man named Walter Brennan who had retired but who answered the phone for her anyway, what her rights were and what her options were, and Walter Brennan had told her, gently, that her son had no legal authority over her or her property, and that she could simply say no. She had said no. She had said no in a careful letter that she mailed to David on a Tuesday, and on Friday David had driven up alone, without Patricia, and they had had the worst conversation of Margaret's life in the front parlor of the house on Linden Street. He had told her, his voice rising in a way that reminded her of a smaller, more frightened version of himself from many years ago, that she was being selfish, that she was being unrealistic, that she did not understand what was at stake for his family, that if she would not see reason, he would have no choice but to consider other options. He had used the word competency. He had used the phrase next steps. He had not, quite, threatened her. But he had also not, quite, not threatened her. After he left, Margaret had sat in Henry's reading chair for a long time. The light had moved across the floor, and then up the wall, and then faded, and she had not turned on a lamp. At some point she had begun to weep, very quietly, the way a woman of her generation wept, without sound, with the tears simply moving down her face and into the collar of her dress. She had thought about Henry. She had thought about how Henry would have known what to do, and how Henry was not here to do it, and how she was going to have to figure it out by herself. She had thought about David at 5 years old, in his red pajamas, asking her to check for monsters under his bed. She had thought about the careful, calculating expression on her son's face that afternoon, and she had understood that the boy in the red pajamas was gone, and that the man who had replaced him was someone she did not entirely recognize, and that this was a grief separate from and almost equal to the grief of losing Henry. She had not signed the page. Instead, she had begun, slowly, to make a different plan. She had started by going through Henry's papers in the small office at the back of the house, the office she had not been able to touch for over a year. She had told herself, that first day, that she was only going to file things, only to organize, only to make order out of the careful, gentle disorder Henry had left behind. But she had found, in the bottom drawer of his oak filing cabinet, a manila folder labeled in his small, precise handwriting, for Margaret, Hadley's crossing. Inside the folder were 3 things. The first was a black and white photograph, very old, of a small white church on a hill, with a tall, narrow steeple and a row of plain windows along each side. On the back of the photograph, in faded pencil, somebody had written, Bethel United Methodist, 1923. The second was a yellowed letter from Henry's grandmother, Cora Ellsworth, dated 1958, addressed to Henry as a boy of 9, telling him about the church where his great-grandfather had served as the pastor, and where his great-grandmother had played the organ for 37 years, and where, his grandmother wrote, the most important parts of our family began. The third was a single page in Henry's own handwriting, dated only 2 months before his death. It said, simply, "Margaret, if you ever need a beginning, this is where ours started. Don't forget." Margaret had sat on the floor of Henry's office with the folder open in her lap, and she had read the page in Henry's handwriting 4 times, and she had thought, he knew. He knew what was coming. He knew before I did. And he left this for me to find. She had taken the folder to her bedroom. She had put it on Henry's pillow, where his head had used to be. She had slept with her hand on it that night. And in the morning she had begun to make a list. She had sold the house on Linden Street herself, through Walter Brennan's son, who was also a lawyer now and who handled the sale with the kind of quiet competence Margaret recognized from his father. She had sold it for a fair price, which was less than David and Patricia had expected to get for it, but more than enough for what Margaret intended to do. She had not told David. She had simply done it. She had paid off the small remaining property taxes, settled the last of Henry's medical bills, donated his medical instruments to a free clinic in West Asheville that Henry had volunteered at for many years, and divided what remained into 3 parts. The largest part she put into a small, simple trust, the kind of trust her son the lawyer would not have been able to easily contest, with instructions that it was to be used only for the restoration and maintenance of a property she had not yet purchased but intended to. The second part she set aside for the practical needs of a woman beginning a new life. A reliable used car, a few months of rent, basic supplies, a small reserve. The third part, which was much smaller than the other 2, she put in a savings account for her grandchildren, Cole and Annabelle, with a note in her own hand explaining that Grandma loved them very much, and that one day, when they were older, they might want to come and find her. She had packed 2 suitcases. She had taken Henry's old leather doctor's bag, which she had filled with what she could not bear to leave. Their wedding photograph, the folder marked for Margaret, Hadley's crossing, a small collection of letters Henry had written her during his residency, her mother's Bible, and her wedding ring, which had grown too loose on her finger in the last weight of being on her own. They were not the same thing. She understood that now. She had been alone for a long time inside her son's plans for her. Out here, with $8 spent and a deed against her ribs and a small brass key on the table beside her bowl, she was something different. She was on her own. She was beginning. And somewhere, 3 hours west, in a Charlotte office she had never seen, her son was reading a letter she had left on a kitchen table, and the careful future he had built around her absence was, although he did not yet know it, beginning to come undone. File system tools still aren't responding. I'll deliver part 2 directly and chat the same way. Margaret slept better than she had any right to, on a narrow brass bed in a boarding house in a village she had not known existed 6 weeks before, and woke at 6 in the morning to the smell of coffee and the soft clatter of Ruth Caldwell setting plates in the kitchen below. She lay still for a moment in the cold blue light coming through the lace curtain. She listened to the house creak around her. Old houses spoke to themselves at that hour. She had always thought, the way old people did. She got up, washed her face in the small porcelain basin in the corner of the room, dressed in the work clothes she had bought at the hardware store, a pair of canvas trousers, a flannel shirt that had belonged to nobody she knew, sturdy boots that pinched a little at the heel and would have to be broken in slowly. She put on Henry's old wool jacket over the flannel. The jacket was too big for her. She had given away most of his things, but she had not been able to part with the jacket. It still smelled, faintly, of the pipe he had never quite given up. She came down the stairs holding the brass key in her hand. Ruth was at the stove, frying eggs in a black iron pan that looked older than both of them. There was a plate already set at the kitchen table for Margaret, with toast and a wedge of butter and a small jar of preserves the color of dark amber. Blackberry, Ruth said, without turning around. I put them up myself. End of August. Thank you, Margaret said. She sat down. The chair was warm. Somebody had been sitting in it before she came down, probably Ruth herself, before getting up to start the eggs. You're going out to the church today? Ruth said. It was not a question. Yes. You'll want a thermos. I have one. You'll want lunch. I have a sandwich. Ruth turned around, 2 fried eggs balanced on a spatula, and looked at her. Mrs. Ellsworth, she said, I do not know what you are walking into out there. Nobody does. That building has been shut up since I had brown hair, and if you ask my opinion, which you have not, you are too small a woman to be walking into it alone for the first time. I am sending Eli with you. Eli, my nephew. He does the carpentry around here. He has known the inside of every old building in this county and most of the outsides too. He is not going to do your work for you. He is going to walk in with you and make sure the floor is going to hold and the roof is not going to come down. And then he is going to leave you alone. Yes? Margaret considered this. She had imagined, the night before, walking up to the front doors of the church alone and turning the key in the padlock and pushing those doors open by herself and standing for the first time in the dim sanctuary as a woman who had earned that moment by her own hand. She had imagined it as a sacred thing, a private thing, but she had also imagined the floor giving way under her boots and being found 3 days later by a man from the gas company who had come out to read a meter that did not exist anymore, and David in his Charlotte office getting a phone call he did not deserve. "Thank you, Ruth," she said. "I would be grateful for the company." Ruth nodded once, sharply, as if a piece of business had been concluded, and slid the eggs onto Margaret's plate. Eli Caldwell arrived at 7:30 in a pickup truck, so old the original color was a matter of speculation. He was a tall, thin man in his middle 50s, with a quiet face and large, careful hands, and the kind of slow speech that meant he thought before he said anything. He shook Margaret's hand and said, "Mrs. Ellsworth, pleasure," and then he did not say anything else for the next 10 minutes. He waited on the porch while she gathered her thermos and her sandwich and a small notebook in which she intended to write down everything she found. He helped her into the passenger side of the truck. He drove slowly out Sycamore Road with the heater rattling. They did not speak. It was a silence Margaret found, to her surprise, comfortable. Henry had been a man who could share a long silence without filling it. She had not realized how much she had missed that. The church looked different in the early February morning. The hard light made the gray clapboards look colder, less silver, and more bone. Frost had whitened the long grass. The red oak threw a complicated shadow across the east wall. A single crow was sitting on the leaning steeple, and as they pulled up it lifted off and flew across the field and was gone. Eli parked the truck at the edge of the gravel drive and got out without speaking. He walked once around the building, slowly, his hands in his coat pockets, looking up at the eaves and down at the foundation and along the line of the roof. Margaret stood by the truck and let him do it. When he came back, he said, "Roof's worse on the back side. Foundation's good. Sills have got some rot at the southeast corner. The bell tower is going to need taking apart and putting back, but not today. Today we can go inside." "Will the floor hold?" "The floor will hold for 2 people walking soft. Don't go in the choir loft." He took the brass key from her. He went up to the side door of the small parsonage that stood 12 feet behind the church, a white frame house no bigger than a fishing cabin, with the same gray weathering and the same air of long abandonment. The key turned in the lock with a small dry sound. The door opened on hinges that had not been opened in 31 years and complained, but only briefly, the way an old man complains when asked to stand up. Eli pushed it open the rest of the way and stepped back, and Margaret stepped past him into the parsonage of Bethel United Methodist Church for the first time in her life. The inside of the parsonage was darker than she had expected because the windows were curtained, and the curtains had not been opened since 1994. Dust hung in the air. There was a small kitchen with a wood stove and a hand pump at the sink. A front room with a worn sofa and an armchair under a sheet. A bedroom barely large enough for a single bed and a wardrobe. A back porch. A pantry. That was the whole house. It smelled of mice and damp, and of something more complicated underneath. The smell of a place where people had once lived and where their lives had ended or moved on and left no one behind to open the windows. Margaret walked slowly through the rooms. She put her gloved hand on the back of the armchair. She lifted the corner of a sheet and looked at the kitchen table beneath it. She found, on the windowsill above the sink, a small chipped saucer with a single dried-up sliver of soap still resting on it, the way someone had left it after washing their hands. She did not move the saucer. She did not move anything. She only looked. When she came back out onto the porch, Eli was waiting. "You can live in there," he said, after some work. "Stove is sound. Pump will need priming and probably new leathers. Walls are dry. It's a good little house." "Yes," Margaret said. "It is." Then they went to the church. The padlock on the front doors was the kind of padlock that nobody bothers to fight. Eli took a small bolt cutter out of the bed of his truck and snipped through the rusted hasp in 2 seconds. The chain fell away. He coiled it neatly and set it on the steps. He put one hand on each of the double doors and pushed. They did not open easily. The wood had swelled into the frame. He put his shoulder to the right-hand door and pushed steadily, the way a man pushes a stuck wheelbarrow. And after a long moment the door gave with a long groaning sigh and swung inward, and the cold dark air of the inside of Bethel United Methodist Church came rolling out around them like the breath of something that had been holding it for 31 years. Margaret stepped inside. She had been in a great many churches in her life. She had been baptized in one, married in one, sat in pews next to Henry in one for 46 years of Sunday mornings. She knew the geography of a Methodist sanctuary the way some people knew the geography of a kitchen. She knew where the altar would stand, and where the pulpit would be, and where the small communion rail would curve in front of them, and where the pews would be set in their straight, quiet rows. All of that was here. All of that had been here, untouched, since the last service in the autumn of 1994. But it was the light that stopped her. The boarded windows along the south wall let in only thin slats of daylight, but the rose window above the altar at the east end was unbroken. Whoever had boarded up this church had not been able to reach the rose window. It was 12 feet across, set high in the apse wall, made of glass the color of deep water and old wine, in the late part of an October afternoon, and the morning sun was coming through it now and laying a pool of trembling colored light across the dusty heart pine floor in front of the altar. The light shook a little because the wind was moving the branches of the red oak outside, and the shadow of the branches moved across the rose window, and the colors moved across the floor, slow and alive. Margaret put her hand to her throat. "Oh," she said, very quietly. She heard Eli, behind her, take in a small breath. They stood in the open doorway for a long time. Neither of them spoke. Dust was moving in the colored light. A piece of plaster fell, somewhere far back in the building, with a small soft sound. The barn owl, which Margaret had not yet seen but whose presence she had been told about, was awake somewhere in the choir loft and rustled once, considering them, and then was still. "I have lived in this county all my life," Eli said at last, and his voice was lower than she had heard it before. "And I did not know that was up there." "Nobody could see it," Margaret said. "From outside, with the boards, you would never know." "No, ma'am." They walked in slowly. The pews were still in their rows, although several had been knocked askew at some point, perhaps by raccoons, perhaps by a fallen ceiling timber. The pulpit was still in place, an unadorned wooden pulpit Margaret guessed had been there since the building was new in 1923. The communion rail curved gently in front of the altar, and the altar itself, a simple oak table covered by a cloth that had once been white and was now the color of weak tea, stood at the east end with the morning light moving across it. Margaret walked up the center aisle. Her boots made small, careful sounds on the heart pine. She stopped at the communion rail and put her gloved hand on it. The wood was cold and smooth. She thought, very suddenly and very clearly, of her own wedding day, of standing at a rail very much like this one, of Henry beside her in his only good suit, of being 21 years old and certain that nothing in her life would ever be uncertain again. "Mrs. Ellsworth," Eli said behind her. She turned. She could not, she discovered, quite see him. She wiped at her eyes with the back of her wrist. "I am all right," she said. "I am all right. Take your time." She took her time. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. For 2 weeks after that first morning, Margaret and Eli worked on the parsonage and not the church. There was no choice about it. The church could not be slept in. The church could not be cooked in. The church needed weeks of safety work before any restoration could begin in earnest, and the parsonage needed only a few small mercies to become a place where a 73-year-old woman could live through a North Carolina winter. They worked on the parsonage. Eli refused to take payment for the first 3 days, and then accepted, after a quiet argument in Ruth's kitchen, a fair daily wage that Margaret had calculated with care from the trust she had set aside. They cleaned the wood stove and relaid the chimney. They primed the hand pump and replaced the leathers and ran clean water for the first time in 3 decades, which came out brown and slow, and then, on the 4th day, ran clear. They tightened the sash on every window. They pulled up a corner of carpet in the front room and found the original pine board floor underneath, beautiful, only needing a wash and an oil. They cleaned the wardrobe. They washed the curtains, which Ruth took back to the boarding house and laundered in a great washing machine in the cellar and returned smelling of soap and wind. They put a new tick on the old iron bed frame in the bedroom. Margaret unpacked her 2 suitcases and Henry's leather doctor's bag, and she put her wedding photograph on the small bedside table, and she put her mother's Bible on top of the wardrobe, and she put the folder marked for Margaret, Hadley's crossing on the kitchen table, where she could see it whenever she was eating. On the 11th evening, when the last coat of oil had dried on the floors and the wood stove was throwing warmth into every corner of the small house, Margaret made tea on the stove and sat down at the kitchen table and looked around her. The lamplight was steady. The wind was moving outside. The parsonage of Bethel United Methodist Church, which had stood empty since 1994, was warm and clean, and somebody's home for the first time in 31 years. It was, Margaret realized, her home. She had not had a home of her own since she had been a girl in her father's house. She had been the wife of a home, and the mother in a home, and a widow in a home, but she had not had a home of her own. She did now. She slept that night in her own bed, in her own house, behind her own door, and when she woke in the morning the light coming through the lace curtain was thin and cold and exactly the same color it had been at the boarding house, but it was hers. That was the morning she began the church. Eli had warned her about the choir loft. He had warned her about the southeast sill. He had warned her about the spongy plank near the second pew on the left, which he marked with a piece of yellow chalk. He had warned her about the wiring, which she should not touch under any circumstances until a man named Carl Whitcomb came out from the next county over to look at it. He had warned her not to climb anything. He had not, in any practical sense, been able to forbid her to enter the building alone. They had a quiet conversation about that on the parsonage porch on the morning of the 12th day, and at the end of it Eli had said, "I cannot stop you, Mrs. Ellsworth, and I would not try, but I am asking you to walk soft. I am asking you not to lift what you cannot carry. I am asking you to come and get me if anything looks wrong." Margaret had said, "I will," and had meant it. She walked into the sanctuary that morning carrying only a broom, a dustpan, a bucket of warm water, a clean rag, and her notebook. She was not yet ready to clean. She was only ready to look, to take the inventory of a place that had been waiting for her, although she had not known it, since the autumn of 1994. The pews. There were 16 pews in the sanctuary, 8 on each side of the center aisle. 12 of them were still in good condition. 3 had been knocked from their bolts. 1, the second from the back on the right, was split through the seat as if someone had taken an axe to it, although Margaret could not imagine why. She wrote all of this down. She named the pews in her notebook by their position: 1L, 1R, 2L, 2R, all the way to 8L, 8R. The hymnals. There were no hymnals in the racks. They had been removed, probably when the church was closed. She made a small mark to remind herself. The pulpit. The pulpit was made of oak and was very plain. There was a brass plate on the front of it, much tarnished, that read in memory of Pastor Josiah Halloway, 1881 to 1923, beloved of his flock. Margaret wrote the name down. She would learn later, from Ruth, that Pastor Halloway had been the founding minister of Bethel and had died of pneumonia in the year the church was completed, and that he was buried in the small churchyard behind the building, under a stone Margaret had not yet been able to find because of the weeds. The organ. The organ was a small reed organ on the right-hand side of the apse, with 2-foot pedals that operated bellows. The keys were yellowed. The bench was missing. Margaret pressed one of the keys gently and got no sound. The bellows would have to be rebuilt. She wrote it down. The communion rail. Solid. Beautiful. A small wear mark in the wood where, presumably, generations of kneeling parishioners had rested their hands. The altar. She had been saving the altar. She walked up to it now and stood in front of it. It was a simple oak table, probably the same age as the pulpit, for legs, no drawer, covered by the dust-yellowed altar cloth. A tarnished brass cross stood at the center of the cloth, about 10 inches tall. 2 empty brass candlesticks flanked it. Margaret reached out and lifted the corner of the altar cloth very slowly, the way one might lift a sheet from the face of a sleeping person. The wood beneath was unmarked. There was nothing under the cloth except the bare table. She let the cloth fall. She walked around the altar. The altar stood about 3 feet out from the back wall of the apse, and behind it was a narrow space, just wide enough for a person to walk. where the pastor would have stood during certain parts of the service. The back wall of the apse was paneled in vertical pine boards, painted a pale ivory that had yellowed with time. The rose window was set high in this wall, perhaps 8 feet above the floor. Below the rose window, set into the paneling, was a small wooden door. Margaret stopped. She had not seen the door from the front of the church. She had not seen it from the side aisles. It was small, perhaps 3 feet tall, set flush into the paneling so that it almost disappeared. The only thing that gave it away was a small brass keyhole, dark with age, set in the right-hand side at the height of her hand. She stood for a long time looking at it. A door behind the altar. She had been to many Methodist churches in her life. She did not know of any of them that had a door behind the altar. There would sometimes be a small vestry off the side of the apse, where a pastor changed his robe, but that was a normal door, of normal size, in a normal place. This was different. This was a door that had been deliberately concealed. She put her hand against the panel. The wood was cold. She tried the small handle, a brass knob, pitted and dark. It did not turn. She felt for a latch. There was no latch she could find. The door was locked, but locked from inside, or with a key, and there was no key in the keyhole. She stepped back. She thought of the brass key Ruth had given her on the first night, the key to the parsonage, which had turned out to fit the parsonage door perfectly. She thought of all the keys she had not yet found. She thought, with a small sharp thrill that she had not felt in many years, of what it was that the founding minister of a small country Methodist church might have wanted to keep behind a door that would not be opened for 100 years. She did not know, but she knew, standing there with her gloved hand on the cold panel, that there was something behind it, and that finding it was now the next part of her life. She made a careful drawing of the door in her notebook. She wrote down its dimensions. She wrote down the location of the keyhole. She wrote down, cannot be forced, must be opened correctly, key likely in parsonage or churchyard. She closed the notebook. She walked back down the aisle and out through the double doors into the late February sunlight, and she sat on the front step of the church, and she looked across the field at the brown winter grass and the stand of pines beyond it, and she thought. A man walking a beagle came past on the road. He raised his hand. Margaret raised hers. The dog did not look at her. They went on. She had been told, once, that some keys are kept for the right person. Her grandmother had said it, about a small wooden box that had stood on the mantelpiece of her childhood home, a box that had been her great-grandmother's, and that had no key, and that nobody had ever forced. Some keys are kept for the right person, her grandmother had said. And when the right person comes, the key comes too. You wait. You do not break the box. Margaret thought, sitting on the step of the church she had bought for $8, that she would not break this door. She would find the key. She did not yet know where the key was, but she knew where to start looking. She knew that Henry had left her a folder with 3 things in it, and that 2 of those things, the photograph and his own letter, had already done their work. She knew that the 3rd thing, his grandmother's letter from 1958, had not yet revealed everything it had to say. She had read it 3 times. She would read it a 4th. She stood up. She brushed the dust from her trousers. She walked back through the parsonage door and into her warm kitchen, and she sat down at her own table, and she opened the folder, and she took out the yellowed letter from Cora Ellsworth to her grandson Henry, and she read it again, slowly, the way she had not yet read it. And on the 2nd page of the letter, in a sentence she had read 3 times before and had not understood as anything but a sentimental aside, she found the line that changed everything. Your great-grandmother, the letter said, played the organ at Bethel for 37 years. She used to keep her music inside the small cupboard behind the altar, where Pastor Halloway kept his last sermon and the things he never finished. She told me once that she had hidden a letter there for any of our blood who ever came home. Margaret put the letter down on the table. Her hands were shaking, very gently, the way her hands had shaken once before, at the kitchen table in Asheville, when her son had used the word competency. She read the sentence again. A letter for any of our blood who ever came home. She was Henry's wife. Henry was gone, but Henry had given her this folder. Henry had told her, in his own hand, this is where ours started. Henry had sent her here. She was, in the only way that mattered, of Henry's blood now. She had come home for him. She sat at her kitchen table for a long time, and the lamplight steadied around her, and the wood stove ticked quietly in the corner, and outside the wind was moving the bare branches of the elm trees that lined the lane to the church. Tomorrow she would begin to look for the key. She did not know yet where it was. She knew only that it existed, and that it had been waiting for her, and that she had been, at last, the right person. The key was not in the parsonage. Margaret looked for 3 days. She went through the parsonage room by room, drawer by drawer, with the patience of a woman who had once organized a husband's medical office. She lifted the corners of the rugs. She felt along the undersides of the kitchen drawers. She emptied the wardrobe in the bedroom and ran her fingers along the inside of every seam. She took the lid off the small chipped saucer on the windowsill and found nothing under it but a faint ring of old soap. She checked the backs of the picture frames that had been left on the walls. She checked the hollow space behind the wood stove. She checked, on the 3rd afternoon, the bottoms of every cup and saucer in the kitchen, lifting each one and turning it over in her gloved hand and setting it down again. The key was not in the parsonage. She sat at her kitchen table on the 3rd evening and read Cora Ellsworth's letter for the 7th time. She read it slowly. She read it the way she had been taught, as a girl, to read a passage of scripture, looking for what was beneath the plain meaning of the words. Your great-grandmother, the letter said, played the organ at Bethel for 37 years. Margaret set the letter down. She had not yet been to the churchyard. The churchyard at Bethel United Methodist was a small piece of ground enclosed by a low stone wall behind the church, and the gate had been overgrown so completely by honeysuckle and Virginia creeper that Margaret had walked past it half a dozen times without recognizing it as a gate. She went out the next morning with Eli's brush hook and a pair of leather gloves Ruth had given her, and she spent 2 hours cutting back the vines until the iron gate could be opened. The hinges screamed. She did not mind. There was, she thought, a particular kind of sound an old hinge makes when nobody has asked it to do its work in a very long time, and that sound is not a complaint, but a question. She pushed through. The churchyard was small, perhaps 30 stones. Some of the stones had fallen. Some of them had been broken by the freezing and thawing of decades of winters. Some of them stood. Margaret walked among them slowly, reading the names. Holloway, Pastor Josiah, 1881 to 1923, exactly where Ruth had told her he would be. 2 small stones beside him for children who had died in the first year of life. A row of Caldwells, several generations of them, including Ruth's husband's uncle, the last full pastor, dead in 1996, 2 years after the church had closed. A scatter of names Margaret did not know. And then, against the back wall, under a magnolia tree that had grown up at some point and now leaned over the stone with its branches almost touching the top of it, a single grave with a low square marker. Cora May Ellsworth, the marker read, 1888 to 1972, faithful organist of this church. Margaret stood in front of the stone. The morning was very still. A blue jay called once, somewhere in the pines beyond the wall, and was answered by another, and then the silence came back. Margaret knelt down on the cold ground in front of her husband's great-grandmother's grave, and she put her gloved hand against the stone, and she was quiet for a long time. I have come home, she said, finally out loud. The stone was cold. The grass at the base of it was brown. There was, she saw, a small bare patch of ground at the foot of the stone, where nothing had grown, perhaps because the magnolia roots had taken everything from the soil. Margaret looked at the patch of ground. She looked at the magnolia. She looked at the stone again. She had lived with Henry for 46 years. She had known a great many old country women. They were a particular kind of person, those women. They hid things in particular kinds of places. They did not hide things in the obvious places. But they did not, also, hide things in places that nobody who loved them would ever think to look. The whole point was that the right person would find it. The whole point was that the wrong person would not. Where, Margaret thought, would I have hidden a key, if I had been Cora May Ellsworth? Not in the parsonage. The parsonage belonged to whatever pastor came next. A new pastor would clean it. Not in the church. The church belonged to the congregation. A trustee might find it. In the churchyard, then. In the place that belonged to no one except the dead and to whoever loved them enough to come and stand here. Margaret looked at the bare patch of ground at the foot of Cora's stone. She went back to the parsonage. She came back with a small garden trowel. She knelt at the foot of the stone. She put the trowel into the bare ground. The earth was hard with cold, but not frozen. She pushed the trowel down 2 inches, 3, 4. On the fifth try, 4 inches deep and 6 inches in from the base of the stone, the trowel struck something that was not a stone and not a root. Margaret put down the trowel. She used her gloved fingers. She brushed the cold dirt away. What she had found was a small flat tin, perhaps the size of a deck of cards, with a paper label on the lid that had long since rotted into illegibility. Margaret lifted the tin out of the ground. She held it in her hand for a moment, and she felt the weight of it, and she felt, also, a small loose object inside it sliding from one end of the tin to the other. She pried the lid open with her thumbnail. Inside the tin, wrapped in a square of waxed paper that had survived because it had been waxed paper, was a small iron key. Margaret sat down on the cold ground in front of Cora May Ellsworth's grave, and she held the key in her palm, and she began, very quietly, to weep. The key fit. Of course it fit. Margaret had not, she found, expected anything else. She walked back through the gate of the churchyard with the iron key warm in her closed hand, and she walked across the yard to the front doors of the church, and she went up the center aisle, and she went around the altar, and she knelt down in the narrow space behind it, and she put the key into the small brass keyhole in the panel, and the key turned with a small precise sound, and the small wooden door swung inward on hinges that had not been opened, by Margaret's count, since at least 1923. The cupboard behind the altar was not deep, perhaps 18 inches deep, 3 feet tall, a little under 3 feet wide. It was lined in cedar that still held a faint, clean smell after 100 years, the way cedar will. There were 2 shelves inside the cupboard, one above the other. On the upper shelf was a stack of papers tied with a string. On the lower shelf was a small wooden lectern of the kind a portable preacher carries, and on top of the lectern, neatly folded, was a black robe of the cut a Methodist minister of the 1920s would have worn, and on top of the robe, square and plain and waiting, was a single sealed envelope. The envelope had been, at some point, white. It had aged to the color of strong tea. It bore, in faded brown ink, the words, "For any of our blood who ever comes home." Margaret took the envelope out of the cupboard with both hands. She did not open it there. She closed the cupboard door. She locked it. She put the iron key into the small interior pocket of Henry's wool jacket. She walked back down the aisle and out the front doors and across the yard and into the parsonage, and she sat down at her own kitchen table with the envelope in front of her, and she did not touch it for a long time. Outside, the first slow flakes of an early March snow had begun to fall. They did not stick. They fell and melted on the porch boards, one after another. The wood stove ticked in the corner. The lamp threw its small, steady yellow light. Margaret took a kitchen knife and slid it under the seal of the envelope, very carefully, the way a person slides a pin out of a sleeping infant's dress, and she opened it. There were several things inside. There were 3 sheets of paper, covered front and back in a fine slanted handwriting that Margaret did not at first recognize. There was a small, very old photograph, a tintype, of a young woman in a dark dress sitting at the bench of a reed organ, with her hands resting on the keys and her face turned slightly toward the camera. There was a folded piece of paper that, when Margaret unfolded it, turned out to be a deed. And there was a small velvet bag, no bigger than a child's fist, tied at the top with a piece of brown cord. Margaret read the letter first. The letter was from Cora May Ellsworth, dated October the 14th, 1971, 8 months before her death. It was addressed, simply, to whichever of mine ever finds this. I have lived in this village for 83 years. I came here as a bride of 19, in 1907, and I have buried 2 husbands and 3 children in the ground behind the church where I have played the organ for 37 years. I have outlived the woman I was at every age I have been. I am writing this in my kitchen on an October afternoon, and I do not know, today, whether any one of my blood will ever come back to this village. Henry, my grandson, lives in Asheville now and has become a doctor, which is a fine thing, and I do not expect him to come back. His children, if he has them, will not come back either. The Methodist Conference will sooner or later close this church, and when it does, the building will fall, and what is in this cupboard will fall with it, and that will be all right, because not everything must last forever to have been worth the keeping. But on the small chance, that one of mine ever does come home, I want to leave a few things. The first thing is this letter, which is the least of them. The second is the photograph. I am the woman in the photograph. I was 22 when it was taken, in 1910. I had been married 3 years, and we did not yet have any children, and Pastor Halloway had asked me, that summer, to take over the playing of the organ on Sundays, because the woman who had been playing was dying. I took it over, and I did it for 37 years. The photograph is mine. I leave it to you because faces are sometimes the most useful inheritance, and you should know what your grandmother looked like when she was a girl who did not yet know what was coming for her. The third is the deed. The deed is to a piece of land of 46 acres on the north side of Hadley's Crossing on Mill Creek Road that belonged to my father and that he left to me in 1919, and that I have never sold and have never built on, because I always thought that one of my own blood might one day need a piece of ground. The land is good land. There is timber on it, white oak and walnut and cherry. There is a spring on the south side. The taxes have been paid into a small fund my husband set up for me in 1923, and that fund is at the bank in the next town over, the First State Bank of Caldwell County, in my name. The deed is in your name now if you are reading this, by the words I have written on the back of it, which my lawyer in town has assured me will hold. The land is yours. Do with it as you please. Sell it. Live on it. Leave it to your own people. I do not mind. I did not keep it for any particular reason except that I could not bring myself to let it go. The fourth is the small velvet bag. Inside the bag are 17 gold coins, which my second husband, who was not a wealthy man but was a careful one, set aside one at a time over the course of 41 years. He told me once that he saved them in case our family ever needed them. We never did. I leave them now to whichever of ours does. They are not a great fortune, but they are something. I have not had them appraised. I do not know what they are worth in your time, only that they are gold and that they were saved with love, which is, in my experience, a kind of value that does not depend on the market. The fifth and last thing I have left in this cupboard is Pastor Halloway's last sermon, which he had written but had not preached when he died of the influenza in the spring of 1923. I have kept it because it was the last piece of writing of a good man, and because a good man's last writing should not be thrown away. You may read it or not. It is on the upper shelf, with the other sermons and the records of this church. Do with all of that as you see fit. I am 83 years old, and I am writing this, and the snow is on the magnolia outside the window, and I do not know who you will be. I hope you are well. I hope, whatever brought you here, that what you find in this cupboard is some small comfort. Be kind to the building if you can. It has held a great deal in its time. So have you, I expect, by the time you read this. We are both of us made of what we have held. With love, your grandmother, Cora May Ellsworth. Margaret put the letter down. She sat at the kitchen table for a long time without moving. The snow went on falling outside, in the slow, indecisive way of an early spring snow, and the wood stove ticked, and the lamp burned. She did not weep at first. She had wept at the grave already that morning, and she had wept on a kitchen floor in Asheville 14 months before, and she had wept in a doctor's office in 2022 when the test results had come back, and she had wept in her sleep more times than she could count. She had been a woman who had been weeping, in one way or another, for a long time. She had no more weeping in her, for the moment. She picked up the small velvet bag, instead, and she loosened the brown cord, and she poured the 17 gold coins out onto the kitchen table. They were heavy. They were the color of late afternoon sun. They were, she would learn 3 weeks later, when she finally took them to a coin dealer in Raleigh, double eagle gold pieces of various dates between 1850 and 1908, in good to very good condition, and they were worth, in current valuation, somewhere in the neighborhood of $44,000. She picked up the deed. She turned it over. On the back, in Cora's slanted handwriting, was a paragraph of careful legal language, witnessed and notarized in 1971, that conveyed the 46 acres on Mill Creek Road to the bearer of the letter by the laws of the state of North Carolina in perpetuity. The paragraph had been drafted by a lawyer. It would hold, as Cora had said. The land, when Margaret had it surveyed and assessed in April of that year, would prove to be worth a little over $300,000 on the open market. But Margaret was not, in that moment, thinking about the gold or the land. She was thinking about the photograph. She had picked it up last. She held it in her gloved hand, and she looked at the face of the young woman at the reed organ, the woman who had been her husband's grandmother, the woman who had sat in this house and written this letter on an October afternoon in 1971, not knowing whether anyone would ever read it. And she thought, you knew that someone, eventually, would come. You did not know it would be me, but you trusted that it would be someone. And you left this for them. She put the photograph down. She put it next to the wedding picture of herself and Henry on the small bedside table in her bedroom, where she would see it every night before she slept. The snow kept falling. The stove ticked. Margaret did not, that night, eat dinner. She sat at her kitchen table and she read Pastor Halloway's last sermon, which she had brought in from the upper shelf along with the other papers. And she read the records of the church, and she read the names of the children who had been baptized in the building, and the names of the couples who had been married, and the names of the dead who had been laid to rest in the small ground behind the wall. And she felt, for the first time in a great many months, that she was part of something larger than her own losses. David came to find her in May. He found her by a process Margaret had not anticipated. He hired a private investigator. The investigator was a competent man, and Margaret had not, in truth, hidden very carefully. She had used her own name. She had bought property at a county auction. She was, by then, known in Hadley's Crossing as the lady who bought the church, and a man with a phone and 3 afternoons could find anyone like that. David drove out on a Saturday morning in May. The dogwoods were in bloom along the road. The forsythia in the parsonage yard had finished its blooming and gone to its narrow green leaves, and the daffodils Margaret had planted in February had come up and been beautiful and were now done. The grass around the church had been mowed for the first time in 31 years. The boards were off 3 of the 4 front windows. The red oak that had pushed its branch through the rose window had been carefully taken down by a man Eli knew, and the rose window itself had been cleaned by a glass restorer from Greensboro and was, now, the most beautiful thing for many miles in any direction. The church was not finished. It would not be finished for years, but it was no longer a ruin. It was a thing being made. David parked his car at the end of the drive and walked up to the parsonage. Margaret saw him through the kitchen window. She put down the cup of tea she had been drinking. She did not, at first, get up. He knocked. She let him knock twice. Then she went to the door and opened it. He had been crying on the drive. She could see it. He did not look like the man who had sat across her kitchen table 14 months before with a folder. He looked, very faintly, like the boy who had once asked her to check for monsters under his bed. Margaret did not, however, allow herself to be moved by this. She had been moved by it before. It was the trick, she had come to understand, of certain kinds of grown sons. "Mom," he said. "David. Mom, can I come in?" Margaret considered this for a long moment. "You can come into the kitchen," she said, "and you can sit down at the table, and I will pour you a cup of tea, and we will talk. But David, you are going to listen first." "Yes?" "Yes." He sat at the table. She poured the tea. She did not put out a plate of cookies, although she had cookies. She sat down across from him. "I have read the letter you left," David said. "Many times, I expect. Many times." "Good. Mom, I am sorry." "For what?" He had, she could see, prepared a speech. He stopped now, with the speech in his mouth, and he looked down at the tea in his cup, and he was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, very quietly, "For trying to make you small. For pretending it was about your safety. For thinking that what was good for me was good for you. For threatening you. For not coming after you when you left, not because I cared where you were, but because I was angry that you had not done what I wanted. For all of it." Margaret was quiet. "I do not know if you can forgive me," he said. "That is not the question, David." He looked up. "The question," Margaret said, "is whether you can be the man your father raised, instead of the man your wife and your firm and your mortgage have made of you. The question is whether you can be the boy in the red pajamas. I cannot answer that for you. I can only tell you that you cannot answer it by coming here, sitting at my table, and asking my forgiveness. You can only answer it by going home and doing the work, every day, for the rest of your life, of being a different kind of man than the one who sat at my kitchen table in March of last year with a folder. What about the firm? What about the house? What about them? Mom, we are going to lose the house. Then you will lose it. People lose houses, David. They live afterward. Your father and I once lost a great deal more than a house, and we lived afterward. You will not die of losing a house." He was quiet. "David," she said, "I am not going to give you any money." He flinched, slightly, as if she had read his mind, which of course she had. "I have money now," she said. "More than I had when I lived on Linden Street, if you can believe such a thing. But it is not for you. It is not for the firm. It is not for the mortgage. It is for the church, and for the work, and for the people of this village who have been good to me, and for Cole and Annabelle, who will, when they are 18, find that there is something waiting for them from their grandmother, with conditions of their own that I have written down. What I have, I came by through the love of a woman who lived and died in this village, and through a husband who left me a folder, and I will not spend it on the kind of trouble you have made for yourself. You will fix that trouble, or you will not. Either way, it is not mine to fix. David put his face in his hands. He cried. After a while, a kind of crying she had not heard from him since he was a small child. She did not, this time, get up and go to him. She let him do it. She drank her tea. When he was finished, he wiped his face with his sleeve, and he looked across the table at her, and he said, "Will I be allowed to come back?" "You will be allowed to come back," Margaret said, "when you are bringing the boy in the red pajamas with you. Not before." "And the children?" "The children are always welcome." He nodded. He got up. At the door he turned, and he looked once around the small, clean kitchen, and he said, "It is a good house, Mom." "Yes," she said, "it is." He went out. She watched his car go down the lane. She watched it turn onto Sycamore Road. She watched the dust settle. Then she went out into the yard and across to the church, and she went up the center aisle to the front pew, and she sat down, and she looked up at the rose window, and she stayed there a long time while the late afternoon light moved across the floor. She lived in the parsonage of Bethel United Methodist Church for the next 11 years. She finished the church in the 3rd year. She did not reopen it as a church because there was no congregation for it, but she opened it on Saturdays as a small community space where the women of Hadley's Crossing gathered to quilt and to read and to teach the younger ones the older ways of doing things. She was joined, in the 5th year, by an old friend from Asheville named Helen Tarrant, also a widow, who came for a weekend and stayed for the rest of her life. Eli Caldwell continued to do the carpentry. Ruth Caldwell continued to disapprove, gently, of every project that Margaret undertook, and to support every one of them anyway. Cole and Annabelle came in the summers, beginning in the 2nd year, and they grew up partly in Charlotte and partly in Hadley's Crossing, and they were, eventually, 2 of the people who came home to bury Margaret in the small churchyard behind the building, beside the grave of Cora May Ellsworth, in the spring of her 85th year. David came back. It took him almost 2 years. He did not bring money. He did not bring requests. He brought, the first time, a small wooden birdhouse he had built with his own hands, which he gave her with a face full of embarrassment, and which she hung from the magnolia in the churchyard, where it stayed for the rest of her life. He brought, the 2nd time, his children. He brought, the 3rd time, himself, for a whole week, and he worked with Eli on the steeple, and he ate his meals at her kitchen table, and on the last night he sat across from her with his hands folded around a cup of tea and said, "I do not know if I am the boy in the red pajamas yet, Mom, but I am trying." Margaret had said, "I know you are, David. That is enough for now." She had, in the end, the life Henry had quietly hoped for her when he had written the single page of his handwriting and tucked it into the folder and slid the folder into the bottom drawer of his oak filing cabinet. She had, in the end, more than she had been told, by anyone, an old woman could have. She had a home of her own. She had work that mattered. She had the friendship of people who had not known her as anyone's wife or anyone's mother, but only as Margaret, the lady who bought the church. She had the love of grandchildren who came to her freely and not because their parents had brought them. She had, on her bedside table, 2 photographs, her own wedding picture, and a tintype of a young woman at a reed organ in 1910 who had left a letter in a cupboard for any of her blood who ever came home. She had been told, at 73, that her time was over. It had not been over. It had only just begun. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you love this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.